Welcome to another episode of Beyond the Sermon. As you can see today, Magrey and I are in two different places. That's because Magrey is coming off of some COVID, I hear. How you feeling?
Great, actually. It's been very mild symptomatically, but I've wanted to stay away from people just as a precaution.
Well, I appreciate that. My wife was like, please don't catch COVID, because in our family, it would just go right around and it would not be fun.
Right.
So thanks for doing this remotely, Magrey. For all of you watching online, you'll see, hey, this is a Zoom call. But for the podcast, you guys are none the wiser. We're in the same room. You don't even know, okay? And nobody has COVID. Okay, so we're going to start, though, today. If you listen to Magrey's sermon, it was on Mahalia Jackson, who was a singer, songwriter, civil rights activist. And Magrey, you dove into her story quite a bit in your sermon. So I don't feel like we got a lot to go into on her story necessarily, but I want to dive into, in this Beyond the Sermon time, the power of music as it relates to our own faith journeys, our own devotional lives, that kind of stuff. So can you tell us a little bit about the way that music has been a part of your life?
Absolutely. I think that most of us can isolate sort of linchpin moments in not only our faith development, but our life journey, where significant songs have served as the kind of soundtrack for what we were going through. Songs that capture the fullness of our experience at the time, both the highs and the lows, particularly in our late teenage, early adulthood years. There's this scientific phenomenon called the nostalgic bump, where the songs you were listening to in your late teens as you were discovering your own identity into adulthood, those songs, whatever they were, whether they be sacred religious songs or secular songs or classical music, those songs tend to embed a deep part of your consciousness, your identity, your brain, so that you can still to this day, when you hear that music, you can sing along word for word. That nostalgic bump tends to fade over time, so that as you get into your 40s, into the 50s now, as I'm in my 50s, you can listen to a song today, a contemporary song, over and over and over again, but you still won't remember those words like you can the songs that you listened to in your youth. And so those kinds of songs can be very helpful to define, to remind us who we are. In fact, Matt, what are the songs that you think of in your early adulthood that you can still sing word for word? And not to put you on the spot, it doesn't have to be a religious song, but any kind of song. What comes to mind?
Alanis Morissette, Tom Petty, Jimmy Buffett,
Right.
Led Zeppelin. It was the stuff my dad, probably grew up listening to.
Right.
And he had playing around the house all the time. And then I guess in the church world, I was lucky enough to kind of grow up in a church that was kind of just driving contemporary worship right in the late 90s, early 2000s. So, I mean, Michael W. Smith, Point of Grace, FFH,
Right.
I should just go on about all kinds of contemporary music that really has also wedged its way into my brain.
Yeah, so when I was sitting in the back seat of my parents' car when I was an early adolescence, they would have playing music by Engelbert Humperdinck and the Commodores. And then later it would be Billy Joel, Elton John, Starlight Vocal Band. I was not until my 20s that I discovered what Afternoon Delight really was about. But when I hear those songs, we don't have to sing the song. Now when I hear those songs, I can picture where I was, my relationship with my family at the time. It's just amazing, the nostalgic bump that comes. And you mentioned contemporary Christian music. I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, Stephen Curtis Chapman was very formative in those years. So it's not surprising that throughout the Bible, there are these pieces of music that serve as nostalgic bumps for the people of God. I mentioned in the sermon the Song of Miriam, which the Israelites would continue to sing all throughout their history as they go through other kinds of wilderness experiences. Philippians chapter 2, the Christ hymn, one of the earliest Christian hymns, would be a nostalgic bump for the early Christians to remember who they are in Jesus Christ. And we could go on and on and on throughout the Bible about different pieces of song lyric that are quoted all throughout the scriptures. So I think it's helpful from a biblical perspective, but it's also helpful from a personal perspective to get to know a person based on the songs they like to listen to.
Right.
You'll remember that when I came back to be on staff in 2015, months before my actual return, I had sent an email to all of you asking you what your favorite piece of inspirational music was. And it didn't have to be a spiritual song. It could be inspirational in any kind of form. And you all sent me song titles. And again, months before I actually came back to be with you, I created a playlist of all those songs on my iPod back in the days when I had a digital media player called an iPod. And my first staff retreat with you all, I distributed compact discs, which for those of you who are listening were these little round flat things that recorded data in the form of audio files. And I made a compilation of the songs that were inspirational to all of you. But the point is, I listened to those songs for weeks before I joined you so that I could get a sense of who you were. And one of the things I love on Thursday morning or Tuesday mornings when we have our staff chapel, Matt, you have on occasion, well, you describe what you do for us sometimes in staff chapel related to our music.
Yeah, so sometimes, I mean, honestly, the first time I came up, it was because I had nothing prepared for staff chapel, and so I was like, I just pulled up Spotify and I said to everybody, like, okay, I want to hear what a song is that's just bouncing around in your head that might be a good song, so that we can all kind of just know what everybody's listening to, that kind of thing. Whether it's, and I would get more specific too. I'd be like, is there a hook in the song? Is there a bridge? Is there a line in the song that really sticks with you? And a lot of the time it was Christian music. I will tell you that it was in staff chapel that I first heard Lizzo's banger, Good as Hell. I hope that's safe to share in this conversation. Megan Kempton brought that one to us, and it was great. And Kristen Passett used to bring us country songs that she was listening to. It was just, like you said, you get to know people through the music they suggest, right? And so it was fun to get to hear what everybody was listening to. I turned that on its head one day and did musical bingo with the staff, using 90s contemporary Christian music, hymns, that kind of stuff. When I would just play a little snippet of the song and see if people could recognize what song it was. So for me, music is always a way to just kind of start a conversation, have some fun, that kind of thing.
That's right. Well, there's another role that music plays in our lives. It's not just for us to get to know each other or to give language to our personality or our spiritual journey. The power of Mahalia Jackson's music was that often those songs were an act of defiance, a song of liberation in the midst of struggle. One of the pieces that sort of made the cutting room floor, if you will, of my sermon, as I was writing it, I was thinking about the story of the cellist of Sarajevo. And I think I've preached on him years ago. It's in one of my books. But one of the most stirring stories I heard out of the Sarajevo War, in this war-torn city that had been just bombed and blasted by this atrocious ethnic cleansing and civil war going on, was that an instrumentalist, a cellist, came out in the middle of the city square, surrounded by shells of buildings, and started to play deep, sonorous, somber, classical music on his cello. And it became this kind of cathartic but defiant act of music in the midst of this sheer terror and tragedy that gave language to people's fears and anger, but also was an act of solidarity. So people came out from their war-torn homes to listen to this music. And it wasn't any lyrics, it wasn't any speeches, it wasn't any spoken shouts of defiance. It was music that not only captured what people were feeling, but brought them together in a kind of defiant solidarity against the world and what they were experiencing. I think that echoes what the Negro spirituals were for African Americans who were enslaved in the civil rights movement. I think of Mary's Magnificat, frankly, in Luke's gospel as a kind of song of defiance. We celebrate it as a song of joy, which it is, but it's also a pretty polemical song against the powers that be, as a warning shot across the bow.
Yeah,
you better enjoy these powers while you have it, because there's a day of liberation coming.
Yeah, and there's something really cool when you can take a poem like that, right, that we think of as one of joy, the Magnificat.
Right.
It was set to lyrics or something called the Canticle of the Turning, and I remember
Huh,
hearing it in seminary. My
huh,
heart shall sing of the day you bring, let the fires of your justice burn, for the world is about to turn. Something along those lines. You can look it
wow.
up if you're watching on
Yeah.
YouTube or listening in your car. Don't look it up there, but it's called the Canticle of the Turning, and it just kind of is Mary's song, but set to this sort of energetic, hopeful, something's about to happen
Huh,
sort of
wow.
energy. It's really cool.
Yeah.
Well, so McGray, if I can share something that actually I realized today after listening to your sermon, I went looking for the phrase "eye of the sparrow"
Right.
in Scripture. I was like, oh, it's Matthew 6, right? His eye is on the sparrow. Spoiler alert, it's not in Matthew 6. What Matthew 6, 25 through 26 says is it's a passage that's probably familiar to many of you. McGray, you actually referenced it in your book, Questions Jesus Asked.
Right.
You know,
Right.
um, consider the birds of the air,
Right.
how God provides for them, essentially gives them food. How much more does he care for you? Why then do you worry? Right. And I think what Mahalia was doing, or what the person who wrote that song, those lyrics, was doing, which wasn't Mahalia, right? It was someone else earlier in the 20th century.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Right. It might have been Thomas Dorsey, but actually it was, no, I'm sorry. I said it in the sermon. It was Sevilla. Her name was Sevilla.
Okay. Yeah,
Right.
she was doing almost like this ancient thing that has been happening all throughout scripture and all throughout faith life, the life of faith, which is sometimes you take something in scripture and you reimagine it through a poem or through
Right.
new words that bring it to life. The people in the Hebrew Bible did that all the time with things that would happen to them. They would remember it in prose and poetry. And so I
Mm.
think what I noticed in that moment when I was looking for Eye of the Sparrow is, or his eye is on the sparrow, is
Mhm.
you take a phrase like, how much does he consider the birds of the air?
Mhm.
Another way you can turn that is not a question, but a statement, right?
Ah,
Not consider the birds of the air, but his eye is on the sparrow. So it was just kind of interesting, right? How much more does he
mm,
love you? Instead of that being a question, it's more of a statement of his eye is on the sparrow. So I thought
right.
that was really interesting. Just kind of think about how words and lyrics can illuminate scripture.
Right. Right. Boy, that's very fascinating because even though um, the the structure of the sentence is different, the vernacular of that sentence is different in the lyric, the truth of it is still there.
Hmm.
And I think that's a reminder of the malleable nature of biblical truth, which it isn't the direct, it doesn't always have to be the direct verbatim quoting of words from chapters and verses. It could be the deeper meaning that speaks to us, that is deeply rooted in
Mm.
the scripture, but becomes activated in our own voice, in our own sort of mental imagery. That's a powerful reminder of the scripture.
Yeah, which kind of draws us back then to the music that we listen to now, right? I think that's
Right.
what worship music at its best, whether it's traditional or contemporary, is ultimately trying to do that, right? I'm just thinking of a song right now, God of the Deep by Dan Forrest, right?
Mhm.
It's talking about how uh, the ocean is so unknowable and the waves and control of the ocean is so we don't understand it sometimes. And yet that's how God is, right? It's not biblical, but it's not like a biblical text, but it is a biblical truth, right?
And I remember that classic phrase, I believe it was by Augustine, who said that when you sing, you pray twice. I remember
Mm,
hearing that when I was a young adult in worship. My old choir director used to say that in the worship service, and I never quite knew what he meant, what it means to pray twice through a song. I've come to understand what he meant as saying that when you sing, you first give language to the deep innermost parts of your soul in a way that only songs, melodies, lyrics can capture. And so it becomes language deep within you. That's the first prayer. And then the second prayer is actually singing it into being, externalizing it for other people to hear. And I think that can be the power of song, that you really do capture what's deep inside you. And some of our greatest scriptures do that, from the Psalms to the Lamentations to the text we've been talking about. And then when you vocalize it, and then better yet, sing it in community with others, that becomes a kind of corporate prayer where you do sing twice. Yeah.
And maybe that's the kicker at the end of your sermon is that Mahalia was the one standing behind Martin Luther King Jr. saying, "Tell us about the dream, tell us about the dream," telling somebody to take something that was internal and put it out there in the world, right? And thank God she did. Thank God she did.
Thank God she did. Thank God she did.
Well, thank you, Magrey, so much for your time today. Thank you guys who watched and who are listening on the podcast. We'll be back next week to talk about Oscar Romero. We'll have Sally Campbell-Evans with us to talk about the Archbishop Oscar Romero. Till then, we'll see you next time. Bye.